Some photos from American history seem normal at first, but end up holding strange and unexplained secrets. One image from 1906 has left researchers unsettled for years. It looks like a regular old family portrait, a mother holding her baby, but there's something hidden in it that doesn't quite add up. The picture came to light in 2019 at an estate sale in Providence, Rhode Island. Margaret Chin, a collector of vintage photos, was browsing through a box of old images when she came across it. It looked like a typical studio portrait from the early 1900s, sepia-toned, carefully posed, the mother sitting straight in a carved wooden chair, dressed in dark Victorian clothing, calm and composed. In her arms, a baby wrapped in a white christening gown. At first, Margaret didn't think much of it. She'd seen dozens of similar photos. Stiff and serious expressions were the norm back then because people had to stay still during long exposure times. But something about this one pulled her back. She noticed the way the mother's hands were placed and how the shadows fell across the baby's blanket. Holding it up to the sunlight streaming through the window, more details began to appear. Margaret's hands shook, and she accidentally dropped the photo. The estate worker nearby, a young woman named Jessica, noticed and asked if she was okay. Margaret just pointed at the photo. Jessica picked it up, looked at it, then looked again. Her face went pale. "What is that?" she whispered. What they saw wasn't just a mother holding a child. Nestled in the woman's other arm was something else, something partly hidden by the baby's gown, something that didn't belong. The more they stared, the more confusing and unsettling it became. On the back of the photo, faded handwriting read, "Mrs. Catherine Hartwell and children, Providence Studio, March 1906. The word, children, stood out. Plural. Margaret bought the photograph for $5 and brought it back to her apartment. The uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. That night, she scanned it into her computer and zoomed in to study it more closely. The woman, Catherine Hartwell, looked to be in her late 20s or early 30s. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes stared straight at the camera. At first, Margaret thought her expression was peaceful. But as she kept looking, she wasn't so sure. It might have been sadness, or something more guarded. The baby was dressed in the usual layers of white cotton and lace, with a cap on its head. Only the face was visible, and even that was partly in shadow. Margaret adjusted the brightness and contrast. The clearer the image got, the worse she felt. The baby's face looked strange. The eyes seemed too still. The skin looked waxy. But what really stood out was the object in Catherine's other arm. It was the same size as the baby, wrapped in similar white fabric, but its shape was off. Once you noticed it, it became impossible to ignore. That night, Margaret dug into local history, trying to learn more about Catherine Hartwell and what life was like in Providence in 1906. It was a busy city then, with lots of factory jobs and immigrant families. Studio portraits were a common way to record important moments. But what exactly was this moment? Her research led her to the Providence Historical Society, where early 1900s records were kept. After 2 days, an archivist named David brought her a thin folder with census documents, a marriage record, and a few newspaper clippings. Catherine, born Catherine Morrison in 1878, married Thomas Hartwell in 1902. He worked at Gorham Manufacturing, a large local company. The 1905 census listed them living on Broad Street with a daughter named Mary, born in 1903. No mention of any other children. But the photo said, "children," and was dated March 1906. Then came a newspaper notice from February 1906. It was a short obituary. The infant son of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Hartwell had passed away after a brief illness. He wasn't named. The date of death was just 4 weeks before the photo was taken. Margaret's thoughts raced. Was the baby in the photo actually the deceased son? Could this be one of those post-mortem portraits people sometimes took back then? In the early 1900s, it wasn't uncommon for families to have photographs taken of loved ones who had passed, especially babies, as a way to remember them. These were usually labeled clearly as memorials, often with peaceful poses, flowers, or religious symbols. But this photo wasn't marked that way. It looked like a normal family portrait. Margaret zoomed in again on the baby's face. The waxy skin, the still eyes, and the stiff body, It all pointed to the possibility that this was, in fact, a post-mortem image. But that still didn't explain the strange second object in Catherine's other arm. She asked David, the archivist, if he knew much about post-mortem photography in Providence during that era. He said it was fairly common for infants, usually done with care and posed to look peaceful, sometimes with family members. Margaret showed him the photo. David looked closely. His expression shifted from curiosity to discomfort. The baby could be, he said carefully, pointing out the rigid pose and the vague features. But then he noticed what was beside the baby. "What is that next to the baby?" he asked. Margaret didn't know. They both stared at it. It was about the same size as the baby and wrapped in the same kind of white cloth, held in the opposite arm. But its shape wasn't right. It looked off, like it wasn't shaped like a baby at all. The fabric fell in a way that made the object's outline even stranger. Margaret asked if there were any more records on the Hartwell family. David said nothing turned up after 1906 in the folder but offered to dig deeper. Over the next few days, David searched while Margaret continued to study the photo. She reached out to photography experts to get their opinions. Everyone agreed. The photo was highly unusual. The way the mother was holding two objects, the unclear subject matter, and the composition didn't match the style of any standard portrait from that time. One expert, Dr. Sarah Chun from Brown University, met Margaret in person to see the original photograph. Margaret had carefully kept it in a protective sleeve. Dr. Chun brought special tools to look at it under magnification. "This is remarkable," she said quietly as she studied the image. "It's like the photographer wanted both objects to be seen, but also tried to hide them at the same time. See how the fabric is arranged." She paused, then said, "It's as if the mother was trying to show something without actually saying what it was, like she wanted to leave a message in plain sight." Margaret's next lead came from an unexpected place, a message from a user named Rhodes Archive, on a forum for historical mysteries, after she shared the story online. Margaret received a short, cryptic message from a user on the Historical Mysteries forum. "Check the Providence Studio Registry, March 1906. The photographer noted something strange. She immediately contacted David at the Historical Society. "Do you have access to old studio records?" "We've got some," David replied. "Which studio and date?" "Providence Studio, March 1906. David took another day to locate the registry. Providence Studio had once been a well-known business on Westminster Street, run by a man named Albert Fletcher. Fortunately, Fletcher had kept detailed records, and his ledgers were still intact. The entry from March 14, 1906 stood out. "Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, family portrait. Special circumstances. Payment $12, triple the standard rate. Note, session held after hours. Private appointment. Mrs. Hartwell insisted on specific pose, rejected all repositioning attempts. Exposure successful despite the unusual request. Negative kept per client's instructions for future reprints." Margaret's heart raced. Paying 3 times the regular cost and demanding privacy, what had Catherine Hartwell been so determined to capture in that photograph? But the final note hit hardest. The original negative had been kept, by request. "David," Margaret asked, "do you know where that kind of glass negative might have ended up? If it survived, it could be in a private collection or maybe at the Providence Preservation Society," he said. Fletcher's studio shut down in 1923. The inventory was auctioned off, but those old glass plates are fragile. Most probably didn't make it. Margaret spent the next week chasing leads. She contacted antique sellers, preservation groups, and collectors. Eventually, she was referred to Robert Mills, a retired photographer who collected vintage photo gear and materials. Years earlier, he'd bought a box of old negatives at an estate sale but never really looked through them. "You're welcome to go through them," he told her. "But I can't promise you'll find anything." His storage unit in Cranston was filled with dusty shelves and old equipment. On one metal rack sat a box of glass negatives. Margaret began carefully lifting each plate and holding it up to the light. She found it on the 23rd plate. There it was, the negative of Catherine Hartwell holding 2 wrapped objects. But negatives often revealed more than the printed photos. Margaret asked Robert if he could create a new print from it. "I can," he said, "but it'll take me a few days. I haven't worked with these in years." 5 days later, Robert called her back. His voice was quiet and tense. "You need to come see this in person." The new print brought out details that had faded or been lost in the earlier copy Margaret had scanned. It was sharper, more defined, and more disturbing. The object in Catherine's left arm was now clearly visible. It was about the same size and shape as a baby, wrapped in the same white christening gown. But there was no face. The fabric seemed arranged to cover it, but the shape beneath didn't match a human infant. The proportions were off. The form was wrong. And Catherine's face, now in better resolution, no longer looked calm. Margaret realized she had misread her expression. It wasn't peace. It was shock. Her eyes weren't focused on the camera. She was staring straight ahead with the blank look of someone who had seen something they couldn't make sense of. Robert stood beside her, silent for a long time. "What is that?" he finally asked. "What is she holding?" Margaret didn't have an answer. But she noticed something else. A note scratched into the back of the glass negative in handwriting that matched Albert Fletcher's. "May God have mercy on this family. I shouldn't have taken this photo, but she begged me. She said it was the only way to show the truth." Margaret knew she had to find out what happened to the Hartwell family after that photo was taken. David had already expanded his research, digging through local records, hospital logs, police files, and newspaper archives. The results were troubling. In April 1906, just 1 month after the portrait session, Catherine Hartwell was admitted to Butler Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Providence. Her intake notes described her as suffering from severe depression and delusions. She was said to be inconsolable following the death of her infant son in February. The records mentioned she insisted on caring for both children, even though only her daughter was alive. Catherine stayed at Butler Hospital for 3 years. The doctor's notes painted a picture of deep grief, but there were also odd consistencies in her statements. One entry said, "Patient repeats same account with clarity, despite treatment and isolation. She's aware of how unbelievable it sounds, yet cannot describe it any other way." But what exactly was her story? What was she claiming happened? Margaret requested Catherine's full medical file, but Butler Hospital responded that the original records were lost in a fire in 1954. Only a few copied notes remained in the city's health records. Catherine's husband, Thomas Hartwell, remarried in 1909, while Catherine was still institutionalized. He moved to Boston with his new wife and daughter, Mary. When Catherine was released from the hospital that same year, she vanished from public records. No death certificate. No census entries. Nothing. It was as if she disappeared. Then, Margaret found one last clue. Among a box of personal letters donated by a descendant of Albert Fletcher, she discovered a letter dated May 1906. It was written by Albert to his brother. "Dear brother, I'm leaving Providence. I can't continue my work after what I photographed in March. You'll think I've lost my mind, but I must tell someone." Mrs. Hartwell came with 2 bundles. One was her deceased son, a memorial photo I would have gladly taken. But the other, God help me, I cannot put it into words. She begged me to photograph them together. She said people needed to know what happened. She told me her son hadn't died of illness. She claimed he was replaced. She said the thing she held in her left arm was what was left in the crib the night he died. I thought she was lost in grief until I unwrapped the second bundle. I cannot describe what I saw. I took the photo. I took her money. Then I locked my studio and didn't sleep for 3 nights. I still see it when I close my eyes. I am a man of reason. But this was not natural. She wasn't mad. She was trying to prove something real. I'm leaving Providence and will never speak of this again. Your brother, Albert. The letter ended there. Records showed Albert moved to Portland, Maine in June 1906. He opened a new studio there, never returned to Providence, and when he passed away in 1934, his obituary didn't mention his years in Rhode Island. Margaret sat in the Historical Society's reading room, surrounded by papers, the newly printed photo lying in front of her. She had the facts. An infant boy died in February 1906. In March, his mother had a private portrait taken, insisting on an exact pose. She held 2 bundles, even though only one child was known to be alive. The photographer was so disturbed he left town and never spoke of it again. The mother spent years in a psychiatric hospital, repeating a story no one ever wrote down. No one ever said, clearly, what that second bundle was. Margaret zoomed in on the new scan. The second bundle was wrapped like the baby, but the shape underneath was all wrong. The longer she looked at it, the more it seemed to change. At moments, it looked like it had a face, soft, round, childlike. But then the image shifted, and it looked like something else entirely, something unnatural. Dr. Chen examined the new print and gave her take. This is either a very convincing hoax, which I doubt given the photographer's reaction, or it's a real record of something the people involved truly believed. So what do you believe? Margaret asked. Dr. Chen stared at the photo in silence for a long time. I'm a scientist, she finally said. I should say it was just a psychological break, Dr. Chen admitted. Then she pointed to the object in Catherine's left arm. But I've studied historical photography for 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like this. The shape, the way the fabric hangs, the size, none of it lines up with what a real infant looks like. She paused, studying the image again. It's like someone tried to make something that looked like a baby but didn't know how. Or like something was trying to copy a baby's shape but couldn't quite get it right. A cold wave passed through Margaret. You think it's real? You think she was holding something unnatural? I think she believed she was, Dr. Chen replied. And I think the photographer believed it too. Whatever happened in Providence in 1906, it was something no one could explain, and the people who tried were ignored or labeled insane. She looked at the photo again, then quietly added, but what really happened? I don't think we'll ever know. Margaret later published her findings in a paper titled The Hartwell Photograph: Early 20th Century Trauma or Evidence of the Unexplained. The academic response was split. Some saw it as a study of grief, trauma, and post-mortem photography. Others felt there was enough unusual detail to suggest something more, something that still needed answers. The paper sparked debate among historians, paranormal researchers, and psychologists alike. Margaret was flooded with emails. Some accused her of fabricating the whole thing. Others thanked her, saying the image had finally put words to strange experiences of their own. But most were from people who had simply seen the photograph and couldn't forget how it made them feel, that something was wrong. One message stood out. It came from a woman named Ellalenina Pritchard, 83 years old, living in a nursing home in Vermont. She said she was a distant relative of Catherine Hartwell, and that she had information passed down through her family. The following week, Margaret drove to Vermont. The care facility overlooked Lake Champlain, and Ellalenina was waiting for her with a small leather journal on her lap. My grandmother told me about Catherine when I was little, she said. The family didn't talk about her. Too much shame around mental illness back then. But my grandmother believed her. Margaret leaned in. Believed her about what? Ellalenina opened the journal. Inside were old letters, pressed flowers, and a few small photos. She didn't vanish after being released from the hospital, she explained. She moved in with my grandmother here in Vermont. Changed her name back to Catherine Morrison. She lived a quiet life, worked as a seamstress, never remarried. She passed away in 1947. Margaret's heart pounded. Did she ever talk about what happened? About the photograph? Not at first, Ellalenina said. But near the end, when she was dying, she opened up. My grandmother wrote everything down. She carefully turned to a page dated 1946. Would you like to hear it? Margaret nodded, silent. Ellalenina began to read. Catherine said her son James fell ill in February 1906. High fever, constant crying. On the 3rd night, she sat by his crib. Around 3 a.m., she fell asleep in the chair. When she woke up, it was quiet. Too quiet. She went to check on him, thinking he might finally be resting. But when she looked into the crib, she froze. The baby looked like James, same hair, same size, but the eyes were different. The way they moved was wrong. And the sounds it made, they were close to a baby's cry, but off. like someone imitating a baby without really knowing what it should sound like. She picked the baby up. It was cold, and it didn't feel right in her arms. The weight was off. She called for Thomas, but he didn't notice anything strange. To him, their son had just recovered from the fever. But Catherine knew it wasn't James. She tore through the house looking for her real son. In the basement, in the corner, she found something wrapped in a blanket. It was small, but it looked like a baby, almost. When she unwrapped it, she saw. Elenina's voice broke for a second. My grandmother couldn't bring herself to write what Catherine saw. She just wrote, something that tried to look human and failed. Margaret leaned forward. What did she do next? She brought it upstairs, tried to show Thomas, tried to make him see. But he refused to believe her. Said she was losing her mind. He took the thing from her and threw it into the fireplace before she could stop him. The next day, he called the doctor. The replacement child, whatever it was declared healthy. No one would listen to her. No one looked closely. So, she went to the photographer. She begged him to take a picture of both the child and what was left of the thing she had recovered from the fire. She had pulled some of it out before it burned completely and wrapped it up again. The photographer didn't want to do it, but she paid him triple. Told him she needed someone else to see what she saw. When he opened the bundle, he saw it too. My grandmother wrote that he told Catherine the remains weren't normal, not natural. It wasn't organic. It was something built, pieced together from unknown materials. It looked like a baby at a glance, but up close, it wasn't. After the photo was taken, Catherine's life crumbled. Her husband had her committed. The image was hidden away. And the child, the one everyone insisted was James, grew up like nothing had happened. But Catherine never believed it was her son. Margaret sat in stunned silence. What happened to that child? He died in 1911, Elenina said. Sudden illness. Very similar to what James had in 1906. Thomas, who had remarried by then, buried him quickly. Private service. But before the burial, Thomas finally looked closely at the body. And he saw. He saw what Catherine had been trying to tell him for 5 years. He never spoke to her again after that. My grandmother believed the guilt ate him alive. He died in 1918. And the daughter, Mary? Margaret asked. She lived until 1976. Never talked about her childhood. But once, she told her daughter she remembered having a brother who was strange. Who didn't know how to play. Who would just sit and stare. She said she was relieved when he died, and felt guilty about that for the rest of her life. Margaret returned to Providence with a copy of the journal. It added context, but didn't solve the mystery. What had Catherine really held in her arms that day? She met with experts. One folklorist mentioned stories of changelings, creatures from myths who replace human babies. These stories appear in cultures around the world. An anthropologist noted the consistency across regions, either a deep-rooted psychological pattern or something else, something people once experienced but couldn't explain any other way. A child psychiatrist brought up Capgras delusion, a condition where someone becomes convinced a loved one has been replaced by an identical imposter. It's rare but documented. Mothers in deep grief or postpartum psychosis can experience this, she said. It's specific, intense, and feels absolutely real to them. But Margaret couldn't accept that explanation completely. Not when the photographer had reacted the same way. She contacted Albert Fletcher's descendants. His grandson, now in his 80s, said the story had been passed down. The story that something in Providence had shaken his grandfather so badly he left the city forever. He used to wake up shouting from nightmares, the grandson told her. Said he saw something through the camera lens that should not exist. Margaret asked if he left behind any personal writings. He kept a note locked in his desk, the man said. After he died, my father found it. Said, I photographed something that proved we don't understand reality. I wish I hadn't. In 2023, Margaret arranged for the photo to be examined using the most advanced forensic imaging available. Specialists looked for signs of tampering, double exposure, any kind of alteration. The results? Inconclusive. If the image had been manipulated, whoever did it had done so flawlessly, with no trace detectable using today's technology. An old photo shows a woman holding two bundles, one clearly a baby, the other disturbingly wrong. Experts can't explain its shape, material, or light behavior. Viewers report nightmares and strange sensations. Despite decades of study, no one can say what it is. Some truths, it seems, resist explanation.